Hey Punam, thanks for joining us here on Lawyer Up.
Thanks for having me.
So, we got back in touch recently because you have joined a team called WiseUp Texas, I believe.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. You know, I know John from, we're both attorneys. We're both Asian attorneys. We've kind of networked in the same circles. We have a lot of, I guess, same interests. One of them probably being just being a good citizen, being politically active. Uh,
Except you are a San Antonio Spurs fan, I believe, and I'm a
Correct.
Mavericks fan. And for folks listening from Houston, I have not defected to the Houston Rockets. I can't do that.
No, that's good. I'm glad you didn't do that. But yeah, I'm originally from San Antonio, lived in Dallas and Houston and Austin, so I've kind of covered the Texas map. But yes, Spurs forever. But I joined WiseUp Texas, which is a nonprofit. It's a 501c3. It's homegrown here in Texas. Started in Austin, really kind of as a podcast actually 5 years ago and a radio show. And the goal of Wise Up Texas is to get South Asians involved in politics and engaged as a citizenry and empowered, educated, active. And it's transformed from a podcast to a full social media platform
Mhm.
and to in-person gatherings back when we were able to do that. This past year, I helped host and manage the podcast. We interviewed a ton of elected officials, including like U.S. Senate candidate MJ Hagar and U.S. Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher. Just really cool experience to get to interview a lot of people and give our listeners a chance to make informed voting decisions.
That's great. I really liked it, and follow y'all to listen to some of the podcasts. I need to catch up, but I think it's great because like you said, is nonpartisan. Really get you, and when it's nonpartisan, you can really get the feel of understand who that candidate is. Right, their guard is hopefully a little bit more down than normal, unlike a you know political ad you see on TV. But
Yeah, and I think we did our best to get people on both sides of the aisle too. So there were some races that we actually covered the candidates on both sides, and I tried to do my best to always extend invitations on both sides. Um, and you can just tell by the tone of the interviews that I am conducting the interview in a nonpartisan fashion, and I think that's really important in this space we live in right now in politics. Things are really polarized, and when you read the news or trying to take in information, you're often bombarded and think, well, gosh, this seems so one-sided. So we're providing a kind of clear view to give people the chance to decide on their own.
and I mean, it's a great start because there's so many issues to talk about, right? There's on one side, one politician candidate could probably, you know, they're probably trying. Unfortunately these days they're playing like identity politics, right? And I think you and I agree that we try to stay away from that. And have you been able to, like, when you're interviewing candidates, been able to kind of ask in a more broad way?
Yeah, I mean, so one interesting thing I always ask candidates actually is, what do you have to say to our listeners and followers who are predominantly South Asian? That question, they always kind of know it's coming, but some of them seem to have a more natural answer for it than others. And some candidates are kind of caught off guard. I will be honest, I think some people are like, what is a South Asian? And how is that different from an Asian? Like some people are still kind of understanding these things.
Right.
And the question really isn't intended to say, well, for South Asians, I'm going to make sure that, they get this special package. That's not really the point of those questions. The point is to understand that we live in this diverse nation where your voters look like all different kinds of people. And so you need to be able to speak to people sincerely and honestly, from all walks of life. And that's kind of what we're really like getting at with that question is, what do you have to say to your South Asian constituents? No matter really even rural districts, urban districts, South Asians and Asians live all over the country. And so our question is just really, it is a broad question. It's not intended to kind of get them into identity politics in any way.
Great. I'm glad y'all do that. Yeah, that's in my mind. It's you know, yeah, like I said, not like a special package, but that they're more considerate of all communities, right? And they've considered South Asians or East Asians, because I remember it had to have been at least 5+ years ago that an elderly South Asian person, he was just walking down the street in his neighborhood, and it was one of those like Karens that called the cops on him, and he got beat up. And so
Yeah.
one of those like, and I think it could have been a North Texas, Dallas area, but yeah,
Yeah, I remember that
hear about it.
story. And there was another one too, just shortly after, I think, the 2016 election, that a South Asian man was sitting in a diner, and a man came in and basically said, like, go back to where you're from or something of that sort, and shot and killed
Oh
him.
wow,
Sort of super heinous.
jeez.
So yeah, I mean, that has been a real reality in the last 4 years, is the uptick of hate crimes
Hmm.
towards the South Asian and East Asian community and a lot of other communities. Something that I think people are expecting to change with this new administration, with greater leadership kind of helping to quell that type of attitude.
Right. Which in a way it seems kind of strange, because like, okay, these people who were, now overtly acting this way the past 4 years are just going to go back into their little, little hole, I guess you can say. Like they're not going to act like, I hope so. We'll see.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I don't think we can solve all those problems with one election, but hopefully we can keep more people safe.
Hmm. For sure. Well, so I know you've been always interested in politics, but is there a particular reason why you've been more active, it seems like, recently in the past couple years?
Yeah. It was interesting when you asked me that, because in my mind, I've been politically active my whole life, but those moments do ebb and flow. Um, I was a political science undergrad major, went to UT Austin and did a lot of lobbying at the Capitol, actually, on
Mm.
different issues, voter ID laws, human rights issues. So I've kind of always seen myself as very politically active. I will say, like, a legal career requires your 100% time and energy. And I went to law school and then joined a corporate international law firm. I focus on employment law. And I think in some ways I was kind of just an active citizen in my own right, in the kind of four corners of my home in my life, but maybe had put down the microphone on that and didn't see myself as somebody that needed to talk about it as much. And I think a lot of that also has to do with, there's kind of this idea, like, should I talk about politics? That's one of those subjects people don't want to touch that much. And you're
Right.
kind of feeling out your space in the world and networking as a young lawyer. You don't want to, like, alienate anyone. But I've always been very active. My parents instilled the value of voting in me from a young age. And I am really glad to have found that my kind of place in all this again. Before joining WiseUp Texas, I want to say it was probably like 2017, that me and some friends just started blasting out emails to people saying, here's kind of what you can do today. We actually called it To-Do List for America. It was a fun little campaign we started. And then I started hosting campaign events too for candidates that I really cared about.
That's
And
right.
yeah, just kind of started recultivating those habits.
That's great that you've invited people to your or host an event. Uh, I think I kind of did that when I lived back in Bishop Arts District in Dallas, but it was more like an outdoor event pre-pandemic. Actually, it was like a race, so it got had him have a chance to meet the neighbors basically. So because I think these days, especially pandemic, people are just behind the camera, of course. So it just gives people more face time.
Yeah. Yeah, I did a virtual event this time for a candidate, and it was still really fun, and people got to ask her questions and learn more about her. So, I kind of, it takes some work, and you have to ask people for money, which is not an easy thing to do. So, you kind of, I don't do it all the time, but when I find a candidate that I'm really passionate about and I really want to give them that extra help, then I do that. I've knocked on doors before too. So you kind of figure out what works for you. I would say there's some things that I'm like, oh, I really don't want to help on the campaign with phone banking. Like, I just really don't want to do it. You don't have to torture yourself. Like, find different roles that work for you to get involved.
Absolutely. I feel like the phone banking and canvassing, going in person door to door, I feel like those are the two toughest task, I suppose, because I've done both as well. And then it's just trying to get a hold of that person is like, oh, click. But it's okay. I mean, just keep trying. You never know. You might get a couple more voters that normally would just stayed home, right? Just trying to
Yeah,
encourage
no,
people.
it's awkward, honestly. I think that's why people don't want to do it. And I don't even normally talk on the phone anymore unless it's for work. So, like, I don't want to be
Right.
calling strangers. But I have a friend who's like very persistent about it, and she's had really great experiences. Like, she's ended up talking to people that are genuinely like, oh yeah, actually I do have these quick questions on where I'm supposed to vote, and she's able to Google it and help sort that out, or say, I'll text you later with the answers. She's actually in Georgia right now, helping door to door.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she's an attorney as well. So, like, a lot of people I think are feeling the passion right now and getting really
Oh,
involved.
that's great to hear. She's extending her time that way. That's very nice of her.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think with my household situation, having a baby, I have to do everything virtual as much best I can.
Yeah, yeah, and then there wasn't as much door to door to do this year. I think a lot of campaigns didn't even really go that route. So, but I kind of want to tell your listeners that there's easier and kind of like ways to get your foot in on this without being like, I have to host an event and I have to start going door to door.
Mhm.
I think the first thing to do is really take a moment and check who all your elected officials are. They might have changed recently with an election. So, just make sure you've kind of taken a moment and put that on your like New Year's resolutions list to take a moment and, double check who represents you in your state house and the US House and the US Senate. And then your mayor, your city council, and your district attorney are all really good people to kind of just make a list. And, I say that very sincerely because I myself often will forget, or I will have moved. Like, I moved a year and a half ago from not that far, but I didn't double check, and I was like, oh, it turns out this person actually doesn't represent me anymore. I thought they would, but they didn't. So check
Yeah,
on
that's a good point because it's 2 years now since I moved out of the 2.5 years since I moved from Dallas, and now it's at least half the council, more than half the council are different faces. So you just never know. And yeah, some positions like every 2 or 4 years.
Yeah,
Switching
some of
out.
them are every 2 years and they're changing, and so take a minute and look. Take a minute and double check your voter registration, and encourage your friends and family to do the same. But I mean, that's kind of step one. And then, in my opinion, step two is like, don't be shy.
Mhm.
Start getting in more of a habit of emailing and contacting your elected officials. That's their job, literally, is to serve us and to hear from us and to address our needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And now come to think of it, at least for even judges, their email addresses are all on the website, so it's very easy to access them.
Yeah, and I think for those of us that have phone phobia and hide behind a computer, the email thing is really easy. I actually, this summer after George Floyd was murdered, I was kind of like, where do I even begin? And I say this sincerely as somebody who considers myself to be politically engaged. And I decided to email the mayor in the suburb where I live. I live in Bedford in
Mhm.
DU. And I was like, I'll just shoot him an email and kind of say, this is on my mind. I don't want Bedford to become the next city on the news for a fatality like this. Like, what
Mhm.
are you doing? Um, Sent an email, hit send. I tried to keep it professional and positive,
Mhm.
as much as I felt like raging and ranting.
Right.
And he emailed me back like the next day,
Wow.
back and forth for a couple of days. All that to say, like, I've had friends who've written US senators and then were so surprised that they got a response. And I'm like, yeah, they do respond. It might not be exactly the letter you were looking for.
Right.
They got it done, but they're listening. And we have to at least start with engaging them.
Yeah, I remember last time I emailed a city councilman in Dallas. He was pretty quick. He was prompt. Whether it was him specifically or his team,
Right.
it was very helpful to see a response in that situation. Now, those are two great points. Thanks for that. I guess I'll have to start going back to my mass email strategy, like you said. But with your knowing that you practice employment law for a corporation, is it important to some extent to be cognizant of politics? And when I say politics, it's not the identity politics, but just knowing, like, let's say if a law gets passed or whatnot. That's what I mean.
Yeah, so I'm an employment lawyer. I'm a corporate employment lawyer. So I'm on the side of the companies and I'm helping companies understand federal, state, local laws and comply with them. I don't know if people realize the law is changing all the time. And you probably have heard it in campaign speeches, where people will say, whether it's raising wages or getting more paid sick leave or marijuana legalization has been a big one. That has an effect, obviously, on the workplace and how we handle things at work. So, a lot of employers, I always am kind of, I'm always one to say a lot of employers are actually staying on this and doing a good job. Like most employers want to get this right. So they're following the law, trying to figure out the law. The law is changing quickly though.
Right.
And it certainly doesn't hurt for employees to understand what is happening, what's in the pipeline. And when elected officials are saying, I'm going to raise the minimum wage, and that's something of importance to you, that's the kind of thing you want to hold them accountable on, is inviting your elected officials about those issues that they promised you.
That's true. Well, you definitely, in your position, you definitely want your employer to comply, because we know plaintiffs lawyers that will take on those cases.
That's right. And I mean, most large companies, they're not going to get 100% right. There's going to be times when, especially because there's individual actors involved. So especially when it comes to harassment or discrimination, we'll do the training all the time. But if there's an individual boss or somebody who's harassing their employees, that those issues have to come to light for them to get resolved.
Right.
But yeah, I think employment law is just one area where the law is always changing, and it makes it exciting for me. I really enjoy keeping up with the law.
Keep you on your toes, just like me.
Yeah.
The past 4 years.
Oh yeah, I think you more than me, but yeah.
You touched on this, but are there other useful and practical ways to keep an elected official accountable?
Yeah, I think, social media might be an easy one. John and I were talking about this before we kind of got going here, and I have a lot of pros and cons when I think about social media. But WiseUp Texas, for example, is a social media platform. There are other really great social media platforms that will kind of tell you, here's what you need to know, and here's who you can reach out to let them know. And then following your elected officials on social media is a great way to see what they're up to see what bills they're passing, to see kind of what their position is on different issues. Or, say you look at their social media and they've been silent on something.
Right.
That tells you a lot, right? You can reach out to them and say, you've been silent on this. I'm expecting you as a public figure to take a position or, urge people to do X, Y, and Z as a leader. So there's just so much opportunity that's right at your fingertips, literally, because I know you're on your phone all the time.
Right. Yeah. It's like,
So
Yeah.
that's an easy one. That's low hanging fruit for sure. And I think just overcoming that barrier of it's going to take me forever to do this. It really won't take you that long. There's also a lot of organizations like Indivisible, Texas Organizing Project comes to mind, Texas Civil Rights Project. Like, find an organization and subscribe to their newsletter and get more educated that way on issues that are going on, especially if you find a cause that's important to you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they're because those organizations could, depending what you pick, but could be advocating for a cause that you care about. So yeah, they could be. Your voice can add to that organization for sure.
Yeah, and they might let because otherwise you've got 1,000 things going on in your own life, and they might be the ones to let you know, hey, this important bill is being discussed, right? Like the COVID-19 stuff that's been going on the stimulus bill. Like, not everyone has time to keep track of it, and that's okay. Like, let someone else do some of that work for you.
Well, talking about stimulus and PPP, there's plenty of YouTubers talking about that. So
Yeah.
sometimes just be careful who you're listening to because they might not know the accurate information, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We should always say that on every podcast or recording out
Right. Always vet your news source, even us,
there. Yes.
please.
Mm-hmm.
But moving on, with a lot of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion talk this past, really after George Floyd's murder, um, I think people are assuming that the Biden administration is going to take a more proactive role, and it does appear that way so far with his cabinet choices. Um, but can you explain, with your experience with politics, why DEI, or at least why DEI is important in the political landscape?
Yeah, so I'll start off by just saying DEI is, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's such a heavy lift when you really think about what each of those words mean.
Mhm.
Um, it's interesting because DEI has been a passion of mine in the legal field for a long time. I've always been involved in DEI initiatives and kind of helping the diversity of the legal field, which, quite frankly, is still a very much white male dominated industry.
Yes.
Um, and I think that message has been like very strongly portrayed across corporate America. If you look at the huge companies, they've all been kind of striving for DEI over the years. What's weird, I guess, is that politics seemed left out in a way of that conversation, or the pressure didn't hit politics. It was very much in this kind of capitalistic, consumeristic world that diversity became the big topic. But of course, it's most important where our leadership lies that we see diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because how can we expect our leaders to resolve really complicated problems like all of the issues that resulted in the murder of George Floyd if they don't have a variety of lived experiences and communities to draw from? So we really need to see more diverse people and diverse ideas to come up with solutions to some of these problems. And I'll just say, an example of that, like, you hear so much about the word community policing, that's really about looking at the community and saying the community and how it is diverse and the way it is represented should be part of the decision on how to police it. You could extrapolate that and say, for the government, like, why would we have a government that doesn't look like the community and that doesn't represent the community?
Right. No, that's a great point because even we have the separation powers in the state and the federal government. That's a good point about the specific neighborhood or community with policing. I mean, every corner could be different and how things happen. So especially with my line of work and trying to get people who are victims to testify and come forward with what happened, this with testimony, their storytelling. So yeah, a lot of
Yeah.
people, especially during pandemic, who are victims of abuse, whether it's a relationship or non-relationship situation, they've been more isolated.
Yeah, no, that I know. I mean, it's tragic that there's been such an uptick of family violence and abuse during the pandemic, and I think you're absolutely right. Like it's understanding dynamics in the community, like why is that happening and how can we address it? But if you live in a bubble where you just don't know that that is a lived experience of so many people, then you can't really address it. So it kind of comes back to awareness. One thing we can do is just keep calling our elected officials, right? Like a white
Right.
represents me, I can call him and tell him, here's what I see in the community. But another thing is just getting more people in these seats at the table who come from different places to talk about their experience.
Now you were talking about the special package earlier. Now with Kamala Harris, being South Asian and also African American descent, is there a particular cause or concern that you believe maybe? I know you're not speaking on behalf of the entire South Asian population, but you know, that at least through your podcast, your interviews, is there like almost a collective cause that's or concern for South Asians?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and quite frankly, is one that I think even pundits are still scratching their head about, because what we saw with the 2018 and the 2020 elections is that South Asians, and really the Asian community broadly, but South Asians too, are becoming a voting base. Like there's
Mhm.
a lot of people voting. They could tip elections. I think there was just a New York Times article that said, they could tip elections, but which way? So they're a voting base, but not a voting bloc. They really don't vote in any homogenous kind of way, a lot like what we see with the Latino voters.
Right.
I think that's true for most minority voting blocs, right? With the exception of Black Americans who are consistently Democratic voters and very strong in that through history.
Mhm.
The other minority community that I can think of tends to split in many different directions. But I will say there are some issues. I think it's the stuff that really ends up being the nonpartisan stuff. So education, with which both sides will say they are working towards, healthcare, which
Mhm.
sides will say they're working towards. So you really have to do your homework there. Um,
I see
and
what you're saying.
yeah, those are kind of two really big ones in economic opportunity. That just that whole concept of achieving that American dream, upward mobility. Um, and then I will say, kind of to the work you do, John, and I know it's been a passion of mine. Is domestic violence in the South Asian community and bringing that to light and helping those survivors. I think Biden is kind of the one of the main people behind the Violence Against Women's Act, and hopefully issues like that can get more
Mhm.
attention. And I don't hear about this very much, but immigration, a legal pathway to immigration for a lot of South Asian families is really important, because people will come here on a work visa and stay here for 15, 20 years, maybe raise a family, maybe even have kids that are born here, and then never really have that pathway to citizenship and might have to leave at any given time. I almost think of those kids as like dreamer type kids
Right. They are for sure.
here, um, 6 months old or something, and your mom has
Right.
a job here, but you don't know how long you'll get to live here. I mean, that's bizarre.
Which, by the way, since you work for a corporation, for folks who are from India and China and other very populated countries, they have a longer wait time, and especially for India, because there's a good amount of folks that for H-1B, when they're
Yeah.
starting out with a job in America, it's I advise my employer clients to, if they are even considering to sponsor for the residency, to do that early on to save that time as much as possible. So
Yeah, no, it's not something I've honestly dealt that with that much in my practice, but it's something that being a South Asian lawyer, that's one of the things people will ping me about, being like, "Hey, can you tell me what I should do about this?" And extent, it's like, oh, there's not really a lot of good answers right now.
Well, I was chuckling also because that it's like that first day you become a lawyer, people will start asking you all these questions that you're not familiar with, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's right.
oh, and
Definitely.
there's my dog Ralph. He tries to be a tough guy. Well, the last question I'd like to wrap up with is about back to campaigning. In terms of, in both of our fields, it's still important to know who your judicial candidate is. You mentioned that earlier, that you were going to, at least with WiseUp Texas, you're going to interview some judicial candidates, or I mean, not candidates, but current judges, presiding
Yeah.
judges. And even when in my neighborhood in Dallas, I remember some people asking me like, what do I consider when vetting these judges? And so, do you have some thought on that?
Yeah. So I think that a lot of people, when they get to their ballot and the judges come up, they're like, I don't know anything about this. And a lot of those maybe get left blank. Maybe you're just guessing. Maybe you go by party line. It's maybe worth noting, in Texas, we elect these folks. That's not true everywhere. And federal judges are appointed, whereas, our state judges are elected. So, um, I my personal opinion, because I am a litigator at heart, so the cases that I handle, I'm doing mostly prevention these days, but stuff that I handle could go to court. And you want your judges to be really experienced and actually good lawyers. So I would say really look at their resume. I mean, if they've done real work in the courtroom, then they will tell you. If they are omitting trial experience and they're not explaining that they used to actually practice law, then you could literally be putting somebody on the bench that's never stepped in the courtroom as a lawyer, and that happens quite often. And
You're
I
right.
don't know that those people are the most qualified for the job, regardless of whether they're Republicans or Democrats.
No, you're absolutely right. I'm glad you mentioned that because there are positions I don't vote Democrat. I have to vote the other side because it could be Republican candidate as well, but I've noticed that some people don't have that experience in that particular field, for example. So yeah, that's very important to at least research that point. At least for me,
Yeah.
I also mentioned like, if it's one other factor that people can consider is, if they give back to the community somehow, especially if
Mhm.
it's apples to apples, pretty much with the experience wise.
That's a great point. Yeah, if they've actually been working in the community and talking to people and care, I mean, you want somebody on the bench that has a broad perspective. They're going to be looking at every case individually. That's really what their job is.
Right.
But you want somebody that cares about the community. And I think the other thing just to consider, like just being very honest about Texas, is we have a Texas Supreme Court that's been all one party for quite some time. We have Texas State House that's dominated by one party and a governor that's one party. So it's like a trifecta of one party. That's not a checks and balances situation. And there are times when you really need a checks and balances. So, I straight party voting, if that's exactly how you feel, that's obviously fine. But if you can take the time and study your ballot, go to leagueofwomenvoters.com. They really break down the ballots really well. And next time you're voting, consider looking at the candidates and figuring out what makes the most sense. But if we can stop having all of one party, that's always going to be a good thing, right? That's diversity of
Right.
that's important.
Right,
Um,
right. Well, I preferably, in my opinion, I think at least for judicial races, there should not be a identity
Parties.
politics or a party associated with it.
Yeah, I think I've used to be pretty strong in that opinion that why do we even have elected judges? It's a mess. I'm kind of confused on it now because at least it's a democratic process and it's not just friends appointing friends, but to
Right.
run for office takes a ton of money and resources and time. And that's all time and money that you're not able to give back to the community as a leader. Um,
Right.
so yeah, I kind of see it a little bit as a rat race. I hate to use that phrase for our judges because that's not
Yeah, yeah,
but it's a lot of time
right.
and money to
Well,
put in.
I believe in California it's like an open election, so it's not segmented off like in Texas, where in California, in one particular ballot you can vote for Republican or Democrat for the primary. I mean,
That's cool.
yeah,
Yeah, and I mean, you can even run like city council positions are nonpartisan races. So technically, although you kind of often know where people lie,
hmm,
have some nonpartisan candidacies where people are on both the Democratic and the Republican ballot. That could be a good way to resolve it. But I think people look at judges and they're like, that's not really important to me, but it is, especially if you've gotten impassioned about criminal justice over the um,
absolutely.
year. The Criminal Court of Appeals in Texas is like the Supreme Court for criminal issues, and
Hmm.
it's really important that you kind of pay attention and see who our criminal court judges are.
Absolutely. I feel like based on the information my neighbors or friends have told me, they're like, by the time they get to the judicial part, it's like they're just done with it.
Yeah,
Especially in
yeah,
Texas, I think this is the first year or last year, 2020 was the first year that there's no more straight party.
right. Yeah,
Mhm.
I think even lawyers, like who aren't courtroom lawyers, like I don't know these judges. Like people kind of think I'm gonna just know everybody and can tell them who to vote for. Like
Right.
always true. You have to go out of your way to kind of learn and educate yourself. But I think it's important and worthwhile.
Well, Panam, we could probably extend this interview for a couple more hours, but I just want to share a snippet of your experience, your observations with our audience. So thank you so much for your time. I know it's quite busy, even though it's remote.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. And I will just say, because I didn't say this when you asked me about Kamala Harris, that that fact that we will have the first woman vice president, and the fact that she is South Asian and Black American is insanely awesome. Um,
Mhm.
I, I am blown away. I did not think that would happen in my lifetime. And when you hear her talk about her immigrant parents and her mother Shamala and her story, and you see pictures of her in traditional, Indian clothes. I mean, it is mind blowing to me that we have somebody like her as our vice president. So um, I will say, regardless of party, I think that is a really interesting and exciting moment in history, and
Absolutely. And
we're living
actually,
through it.
along those lines, you being a Spurs fan, I think it was just this week or last week, Becky Hammond just made her first appearance as a coach for the Spurs.
Yeah, Popovich, as everybody knows, is just epic as a human. And if you're into politics, he's been very fun to follow, especially the last 4 years, because he's got strong opinions on Donald Trump. But yeah, he's also a feminist and knows that women can be talented at everything, and including men's professional basketball. So excited for that.
Yeah, that's great to see her leading the breaking barriers there on
Yeah,
the NBA sideline. Well, anyways, thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you soon.
sounds good. Thanks, John.
Bye.
Bye bye.